Everyone, I just got done recording my conversation with Jennifer, and you are going to love it. She talks all about the sex trafficking situation in Houston, Texas, and it is fascinating. She has great stories in the brothels, about recruitment, about the Chinese culture, and we talk about all kinds of things related to the trafficking situation there, and you're going to learn a lot, and you're going to be inspired. So, let's get to it. I'll just give a little greeting here. So, welcome everyone to another edition of The Doctor Is In, and I am so happy today to have Jennifer. Jennifer lives in Houston. She's a physician assistant, and we met way back in our China days. Well, that was more than 10 years ago, I'm sure. 10, 12, yeah, more. Not quite 20, but yeah, somewhere between 10 and 15 years ago, we started meeting at conferences in China, and then medical conferences, at international conferences. And so, yeah, it's a pleasure. And Jennifer is doing some really cool work in Houston, Texas. And I'm thrilled to learn a lot more about what she is doing down there. And so so I'm just going to let you introduce yourself to our audience. Who are you, Jennifer?
Thank you for inviting me today. I'm really excited to be with you as well and your participants. And so we haven't lived in Houston since 1987, even though I'm a native Houstonian. And moving back in 2014, Houston was a completely different city. And so one of the unique things that we got to do in that absence of 25 plus years was live 15 in China. And we were language students, still are, because you'll never master that language. But anyway, coming back to Houston in 2014, all the signs are in Chinese in one part of town. Like there's this huge influx of Chinese. And so it's been really fascinating. I never anticipated having that. So it's been good to be back. Aging parents brought us back to Houston. And so that's why I'm here.
Great. And so what are you doing there in Houston? I mean, what are you doing now? Because I think it's gone through a couple of iterations. And so what's your job, work life there?
All right. Thank you. So basically coming back from China to Houston and having Mandarin, I started learning about the trafficking situation in Houston. And there are something like over 300 brothels, Asian brothels in Houston. And when I started learning about that, I started getting educated more about the Houston situation. And fortunately, I had heard your lectures and Gloria over the years about human trafficking, read books, and seen Benjamin Nolo's Nefarious and his other films. And so had that on my heart already. I just didn't know that was going to be something I'd be involved in here. So I started volunteering with an organization, and they only had one person going into the Asian brothels. Everybody else was going on outreach to the cantinas and to the streets. And so I thought, well, you don't really need one white lady that speaks Chinese, do you? But by default, I've been the white lady that speaks Chinese, and that's what my friends refer to me as. So anyway, so by default, I started going into the Asian brothels and just being educated about that. And we'll talk some more about that. I've primarily worked in family practice in underserved and underinsured patients in a federally qualified health clinic. And so I have done a lot of education of my young patients because there's so much trafficking going on, pimping going on in Houston. And when I have all these young girls coming in for repeated STD checks or STIs, having the opportunity just to talk with them about what's happening and then finding out, their boyfriend's in jail or this or that. And so just very high risk patients. And then about 6 months ago, I started with a different clinic, and it is a higher population of LGBTQ and a lot of transgenders. And so I've had an opportunity to bring that training with me and really have a high level of suspicion or high index of suspicion, however you say it. So just recognizing patients and just sitting back and saying, hey, tell me what's going on. and just opening opening the room up to whatever they want to tell me. And I mean, I had a patient not long ago. She just broke down crying. I mean, the room was filled with the smell of alcohol at 10:30 in the morning. And she was like textbook. I walked in, it's a freezing cold morning in Houston. She's got on a halter top. She's got on, just this little thin overshirt and leggings. Room reeked of alcohol. And I just sat down on my stool and said, hey, tell me what's going on. And I mean, she just broke down crying. And I think it's a universal theme of how tired women always are. Not that there aren't men as victims as well, but I haven't encountered them as much. They're tired. They want to escape the life they're in, the life. And this young woman, she was 20. She was drinking a bottle of vodka a day just to get through the day. And she'd been coming to the clinic probably like 6 years.
Wow.
And starting at 16, treated for syphilis and some pretty heavy duty stuff. And someone had even flagged her chart as high risk, but I don't know if anybody ever reached out to her or, offered her like a solution. So I've, had a lot of opportunities to educate and also educate my coworkers.
Yeah. I mean, because, patients just, okay, so a high risk, so the chart is flagged, but then the doctor or the nurse or the physician assistant or someone's got to cross that bridge and reach out to the patient. And wow, that's pretty heavy stuff. And then, but what an amazing opportunity that you've got this training, you've got the history in China, you've got the language, and you are just right there in the middle of it. Wow, that's
And I feel like that also I have eyes to see them.
Exactly.
When you have trained eyes as a healthcare provider, you see the things other people don't see. And so I have a lot of opportunities just to open the questions. I see a lot of transgender patients, and I know that they're very high risk for trafficking. And there's a small corner in Houston where it's just transgenders, maybe 5 or 6 transgender people. And so, Houston is really a unique place in that there are so many NGOs focusing on, all aspects of trafficking here. They're on the outreach side, on the rescue side, on the aftercare side, but it's very siloed. And it's hard to imagine to even say, but it feels like they're almost like a little cliquish. Like you want to get in and work with this group. And no matter how, I attended a meeting for 3 years on healthcare professionals against human trafficking and never was on the inside circle. And it was a small meeting, maybe 15 people.
And presumably they were looking for volunteers or looking for people to step up.
I volunteered a million times even. They were putting together, a dog and pony show to go out and train people. And I'm like, I'd be happy to do that. Here I am a year later, never contacted. So it's really strange.
Yeah. You see that unfortunately around the world. It's siloed work. There's a zero-sum game. There's a zero-sum of the pie that, for funding, and it's more like a competition and a clique rather than, keeping the objective, the people who you're supposedly trying to help. And, that's sad. Okay, so I want to, before we kind of go on, we might jump back and forth there because you just unloaded a lot of stuff to talk about. So when you said there's 300 brothels, and so what? Tell me, is prostitution legal in Houston, or what?
And that's the question. So supposedly it's illegal, and they're in strip centers. There's one 5 minutes from my house. They're everywhere, and they're not hidden. And there's even a system of rating them on Yelp. So you put in the name of the brothel, and they rate the women according to their services. And it's just mind-boggling. So the outreach that we do is we have different routes, and different people will volunteer to take teams. Now, of course, that was suspended with COVID, but in general, we take different routes and we go to different places. And so let's say today I'm in A1 spa, and it gets closed down and moves, a block over. And so now it's B1 spa, but on the door underneath it will be A1 spa, just to make sure that you're in the right place.
Okay.
And so it's mind-boggling. I think what got me the most brokenhearted when I first started going into these brothels about 5 years ago was we were going upstairs in an apartment complex on the second floor, and I just opened the door and walked in, and it was just set up like an Asian apartment. It was like walking through the wardrobe into Narnia, except it was walking into China, and it's, just set up like a Chinese apartment. And I look to the left and there's an ATM machine. I'm like,
in the flat,
in an apartment on the second floor.
Wow.
And then next to that, are all these security cameras, and there's a little table where there's this man and lady, both Chinese, talking to each other. And so they didn't know I spoke Chinese. And
right. I love that. Yeah.
It's all cash basis, and they're talking about their books and all that kind of stuff, ignoring me kind of, even though it's like, I'm in your apartment. and a woman comes around the corner, kind of scantily clad, and then she goes back, and I'm like, unbelievable. So once I saw that ATM machine, I just, it just broke me. It's like I can never get that image out of my mind. And that's how they're set up here. So the typical Asian brothel, you walk in, there's like a little lobby, small, with maybe one or two lazy boy chairs, an ATM machine, and then there's always a second door. And the second door is usually a screen door, but it's locked. I mean, it's screen and with metal. And I just yell back there, bong boo bong.
Okay.
Anybody home? And if they're not busy, they'll come out and talk. And I try to take Asian snacks and just reach out to the women. Where are you from? And just, really make friendships with them as much as you can. The average age of an Asian woman in Houston is 42. Most all have families back in China. And of course, you can imagine how mortified they are. One night I went in one of the brothels, and there was a woman that had been there like 3 days. She couldn't even look at me in the eyes. She was so humiliated and just crying the whole time. And of course, Asia is a shame-based culture, and to just see her so broken down. And about a month later, when I went back, she wasn't there. And so I said, well, what happened? And they said, well, she wouldn't quit crying, so they sent her somewhere else. I'm like, well, where did they send her?
Yeah,
did they
right.
actually send her, or,
Yeah, right.
My understanding is that the average lifespan of a woman in trafficking and prostitution in Houston is about 7 years, because it's brutally violent.
Yeah.
And they are constantly, moving them from place to place, city to city, so they don't get attached to anything or anyone.
Yeah.
So it's just been really heartbreaking, but at the same time, to be a woman, and sometimes bringing some men with me that don't want anything, to just reach out and, give them a hug. I mean, they're so receptive to me. And I think that, just like you can imagine, you're single, you want that physical touch of someone that doesn't want to take something from you.
Yes. Yes. You want to be a person. You want to be seen as a human, not as a commodity, not as a product. Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow. So tell me, okay, so many questions. I hope I can remember them all. How are these brothels? Is it a spa? Is it massage? What's the front of it? I mean, is there a typical front?
Massage.
Okay. So it'll be like Asian massage or something like that. Now, are the women mixed when you go in? Is it pretty much one place is all Chinese and one place is all like Vietnamese and one place is Thai, or are they kind of mixed up as far as the Asia ethnicities?
Probably
all Chinese?
99% are Chinese.
Okay.
I've only been to one that had a Korean mama-san, and I think her girls were Chinese. They were not Korean. I mean, I almost have never met a Korean woman in an Asian brothel. I've almost never met a Thai woman in an Asian brothel. So primarily it's Chinese.
Okay.
I think that the Vietnamese have been in Houston so long that if they have brothels that are Vietnamese, I don't know. I haven't seen them. The Vietnamese women primarily work in nail
Yep.
salons. And I haven't, since I don't speak that language, cracked that code to
Yeah.
learn. Is there, trafficking going on? Probably, but
Well, I mean, it sounds like you've
yeah,
got your hands full with just the Chinese
yeah,
situation. And so are
absolutely.
they, do you think they're coming in with by snakeheads? I mean, are they have a situation where there's recruiters trying to get these women saying, "Hey, you need money. We've got some job promises for you." Are they being recruited that way, like the Chinese snakeheads, or are they sort of immigrating, or is it the immigration initiated from the women, saying, okay, I'm going to go, and then they wind up in a dodgy situation, or is it mixed? Do you have any idea about that?
Good question. I think if I were a 42-year-old Chinese woman, I would not wake up one day and think, I'm going to go to America where I don't speak the language and start a new life. I'm going to make more money than I can make in China with no skills.
Yeah.
So I think that the primary way that they're coming to the States is through a recruiter that promises them a good job in a hotel or a restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get here and they're sold, and there you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
With
Yeah. And
little
so,
hope of ever getting out.
yeah. And so the guess is that they really are trafficked. Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah. But I
And
mean,
it's health. Yeah, go
huh,
ahead.
no, I mean, just staying on the trafficking, but, it sounds like, there could be a lot more on the investigation, sort of the police side of things to kind of get through that, or have there been some raids or busts, or people who watch this regularly know that that's not the way to solve the problem, but you do, it sounds like there's something that could be really, there's some low-hanging fruit there, to
Right.
be done about this.
Yeah, so Houston has a big vice squad specifically trained on human trafficking, and they do raids in some of these brothels. And interestingly, a group of volunteers and myself went into a brothel one night, and we thought we heard children's voices on the other side of the door, and we called the national hotline and reported it. Well, very interestingly, about 2 months later, it was closed down. And within 6 months, the police actually were using it as a sting operation in that same location. And I probably a year or two later, I had the opportunity to meet one of the vice policemen that had been on that raid specifically, and told me that there weren't children. So I was thankful to, actually have the whole loop closed. But there were shackles, and there were,
Wow.
places where they were actually physically being held. And you don't think about that happening here because they, psychologically break them down so much. But in that particular location, they found shackles, and that just really broke my heart too.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me, when you're going into one of these brothels, how is it how are you received? I mean, you explained the one time you were just kind of standing there and there's an ATM and they're kind of ignoring you. But
Yeah,
I mean,
that was,
do you have to make, do you have to talk with the mama-san or the boss, for those people, or are you getting access to the women, or do you have to kind of schmooze with the boss first? How does that work?
yeah, that's a great question. So the majority of the lobbies are unmanned because they have so many security cameras everywhere. Somebody at some location is monitoring who's coming and going. But what I do is I just yell back in Chinese to see, is anybody there? Are you busy? And so hearing someone speak their language that's a female kind of is a draw for them. And they come out, and I just tell them, hey, I'm just here. I'm a church lady coming to say hi. And, I wanted to give you some small gifts, and I always have something small. And it's just like, if they're not busy, they will come out, or they'll
Mhm.
tell me, I'm sorry, I'm busy, come back another time. And so I almost always get to interact with the women. And I've actually had some ask me to come in and to, come back. One Chinese New Year, particularly, I had arranged a lot of gifts. And so we went into this one, and there was just one woman. Most of them have maybe 2 or 3 women
Mhm.
unmanned in front. And so she said, "Oh, come back with me." And she took me because she wanted to give me something for Chinese New Year. And so she took me into her room, which was, a teeny tiny room with just a little twin bed. And I noticed that there was a computer set up right next to it. And she dug under her bed and, pulled out some little purse or something. And I was just like, oh, no, no, I can't take that. I said no 3 times. And, eventually she was okay with me not taking it,
Yeah.
which is rare. But
Right. Yeah.
I mean, to be taken into someone's room was so intimate.
Wow.
But
Yeah.
it also led me to see that when they don't have customers, they're probably doing cyber sex,
Yeah.
and that they're busy no matter what.
Mm.
And that was a side I hadn't really thought about that much. But that's the hardest part to catch or to find, is women that are, locked in these small rooms
Yeah.
performing sex
Yeah.
via webcam.
So
But,
when you've been able to go back, you get the feeling that that's where they're living too, right?
oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you see the laundry hanging in the restroom,
Right.
or, the food kind of, if you look back, there's a kitchen, and
Yeah.
absolutely. So the few that I've been invited into, 100% they live there.
Yeah. Wow. And you get to talk, maybe, do you ever ask them about their family home and they have kids at home
Oh, yeah,
mostly?
that's all I
Yeah.
try to talk about.
Yep.
It's just, what part of China are you from? Oh,
Mm-hmm.
really? Have you ever been to Xiamen, where I live, and so beautiful, and oh, I bet your city's so beautiful, and you have a son or you have a
Yep.
daughter, and just really,
Yep.
praise them for whatever their life is, and
Exactly.
just help them get in touch with those emotions that they probably have just so pushed down.
Yeah. And
And
having another human being acknowledge that they're a mother, that they have a family, and that they're still, yeah, that still speck of hope to go back, hopefully. Wow.
yeah, and they're so kind to me.
Yeah.
So many times they'll run and get a bottle of water for me,
Mm-hmm.
or just to try to give me something, because they're so appreciative of me going in. And so it makes me know that there's a need there, and that I really feel that I was prepared for that specific thing by learning Chinese. I just
Yeah.
never anticipated, but
That's
it's very touching.
that's an unbelievable blessing. I mean, something you never even anticipated in the,
No,
yeah.
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 So one thing I was going to mention is
Hmm.
that, there's a lot of statistics about trafficked people having some type of interaction with a healthcare provider. And in reality, I think that the Asians probably have their own physician that's being paid to take care of the women. I think that primarily it's the triads out of Hong Kong and the mafia out of China that are bringing women here, and that they have somebody on their payroll that's, taking care of their STIs or abortions or whatever the health needs are. And unless they're beaten within an inch of their life, they don't end up in the healthcare system. I'm fortunate that I have a daughter who's also been trained in human trafficking. And so she's been able to train her healthcare system, and has actually picked up on quite a few victims of trafficking when they were there, with just horrific conditions of broken bones and,
Yeah.
something really major. But it has allowed them to actually come into contact with the healthcare system, and one that's prepared
Yeah.
for them. So I find that interesting. And then just one sidebar, because Houston shares over 2,000 kilometers of border with Mexico, the cartels also have a big presence in Houston of
Mm-hmm.
cantinas. And my understanding is, I haven't been in those, because even though I speak Spanish, having grown up here in Houston, that basically, as you go in, you pay to have a drink with a lady, and then there's some place on the premises, or maybe a house next door, where you go and, get what
Yeah.
you paid for.
That's right.
So
That's right.
there's the 3 main groups really in Houston. So there's the Asian brothels, which we're talking about, but there's also the Mexican cantinas, and then there's the street which is primarily young Black women
Mm-hmm.
that could be 16 on up.
Yeah.
And there's one main street, or the Blade as it's called here.
Mm-hmm.
And the women just walk up and down
Yeah.
all night
Yeah.
in what looks like spandex underwear and I don't know what top you would even call it, but
Yeah.
no matter the conditions, rain, shine,
Wow.
sun, whatever. So those are the three main groups here.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have a lot of people coming up from other countries that are being trafficked. And we can talk about the men for just a moment.
Sure.
Because
Love
of the
to.
clinics where I've worked are for uninsured and underinsured, I've had a lot of opportunities to meet men that are primarily working in the lawn services, construction. And so I've actually find that they come more often than the women do because they're not like under that watchful eye where they
Mm-hmm.
have to constantly be performing. And so I've had opportunities to talk to them, but they're here earning a living, and so it's a whole different scenario of they're not going to go back to their home country because they're here. They are earning some money, however much it is. Whereas along the border, I think there are more young men being trafficked to ranches and probably fruit picking and more manual labor or agricultural labor
Mm-hmm.
that are being taken advantage of. But being in an
For
urban
sure.
city, I don't see that as much, but I know it's there.
Yeah, of course. Wow. And so, do you have any idea about the mix? Because when you say the 300 brothels, estimated, and so those are basically those are split between the Asian and the Mexican cantinas. Or would you also say
So,
that there's some of them that are also mixed, or some of the other American teens in there too, or
so
no?
it's very territorial.
Oh
The
yeah,
Asian brothels are
no
the
doubt,
Asian brothels,
no
and the
doubt.
cantinas are the Mexican cartel. And those two, are not
Yeah,
anywhere located close to each other.
right.
And then the younger women that are more domestic
Mm-hmm.
trafficking and prostitution are either in the strip clubs where they're
Okay.
doing dancing, and then on the side are forced to
Okay.
do whatever,
Yeah.
and on the streets. So it's very distinct in terms of education background, if that's a good word,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of how they grew up. I had a patient that her mother, her grandmother was a crack addict. Her mother was a meth addict. And there was no man in the home other than the men that came through routinely. And she was part of the payment, from a young age. And so when I met her, she's working the street in Houston. And so it's just that whole thing about choice. Do they have a choice?
Right. Right. I mean, there's somehow, that agency of and choice, like, yeah, it's a choice, but really, no.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
That's
that's the
not
way it is the world over, really, for the majority of women
right.
in this situation. I mean, it's just no choice. I mean, not technically trafficked, but then again, yeah, not really. They're just
Right.
enslaved by a lot of psychological and historical
Social.
slavery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The one compelling statistic that I read about Houston is approximately 2,900 men buy sex in Houston daily, which is over 1 million in a year.
Right.
I mean, that's mind-boggling.
And
And
what's the population of Houston then? If we're talking about, this
oh
many
gosh,
customers and this many brothels, how many?
now you're asking me a statistic that's not in
Oh,
my head.
okay. Well,
I
I
should
mean,
know that
it's a
question.
couple,
Yeah.
it's a couple million at least for sure.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean,
of
yeah.
course. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, maybe I'll look it up.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Anyway, well,
But
it's
when I
not a
read
small
that,
city. It's not a small city. People have heard of it.
no,
So,
it's a big urban city,
yeah.
and the majority of the sex is bought between the hours of 12 noon and 1 o'clock. So men going on their lunch hour. Yeah. So it's crazy.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
back to your question, yes, it's illegal.
Yeah, right. I mean, yes. I mean, that was that's a rhetorical question because I know it's illegal, but it's kind of like, in Thailand where it's also illegal, but it's just
Yeah.
out of this world. Sounds a lot like Bangkok, actually.
Yeah, and even China, it was crazy. In our building, we had in China they used to be set up as barber shops
Yeah,
with the pink light, and we would
sure.
always call them a scissorless
That's
barber
right.
shop.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And we had friends that were policemen, and one day we were walking past one together, and I'm like, "Isn't that illegal?" And she goes, "Oh, it's not really clear. It's not, you can't." I don't think so. And I'm like, "Okay,
Probably
got it."
not, but that's not my beat. That's not my jurisdiction.
No.
Yeah. So,
And that, to me, one thing I wanted to add about that is, there's a large population of Chinese in Houston, and I've tried to engage the Chinese churches here to go with me and to reach out to Asian women, and it's an entirely different dynamic. I think because I'm white, that it's not that same shame-based Chinese on Chinese, because the people I have taken with me, the women I've taken with me that are Chinese from other churches into the brothels, like 10 minutes later, they'll tell me, "Oh, there's no trafficking going on here." And I'm like, "Well, what?" And they're like, "Oh, yeah, they can leave if they want to." And I'm like, "Okay, I just,
so
it's not their problem, is the bottom
yeah,
line
yeah, it's not their
either."
problem, or they just don't want to admit that it's part of their culture, that they're feeling shame because of because these are Chinese women and they're Chinese and they just would rather have their head in the sand about what's going on. Like they just don't want any responsibility for it. Something like that. I
I
mean,
don't
we
know.
both have lived in China, so we get this shame culture. I'm just trying to
Right.
kind of explain it for people who may not understand that as well. That, yeah.
Yeah, the shame honor system. I really, it's baffling to me still, because I have gone to leadership conferences where it's all Chinese churches, and had opportunities to meet individually different pastors and talk to them individually. And, they're going to Mexico for example, or they're going
Right.
to, Africa or something. And I'm just like, oh, I mean, they do not recognize the problem in Houston, which is where they are.
No, they
And
don't want to, maybe.
there's no traction.
Yeah. They
Yeah,
don't want to. It's too close to home.
something.
Maybe there's
Yeah.
some people in the church participating in this activity.
Maybe they own some of the buildings.
Yeah.
I think one of the targets has to be, who is the owner of the building where these places are. And that's been one way that some people have, focused on that and just reached out and said, "Hey, look, you're renting the space and this is what's going on there." And, some will just, of course, feign ignorance, but some will be, legitimately concerned. And so, maybe one or two will get closed down that way. But
Yeah.
it's
But it really
really,
sounds like what really is going to work the best is to not go through what, Americans would say, yeah, do the police raids or whatever, because these are the American police coming from the outside. But for the real change, it does have to be through this Chinese community, because that's where the more profound the grassroots change is going to come from, is going to come from within the community, really, because of the
yeah.
owners, the clients, yeah, that's
Yeah, and
going to
it's
have to
not
happen.
Chinese men going into the Asian brothels. It's primarily white or African American. We
Okay.
reach out to the men, the consumers, a lot as well as part of our outreach. If we encounter a man in the parking lot, we might just try. We know that men have that one-track mind, zone focused, and just try to break that by saying,
Yep.
"Hey, that could be your mother, your sister."
Yep.
Just trying to break that. Or if they're inside, just
Yep.
trying to get them to, like, "Hey, wake up out of your
Yeah.
stupor."
Does your mama know
But
where you are? Right.
exactly,
And
I've
this is like,
had that
wait. Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, your mom didn't raise you to be like this, did she? I bet she's praying for you right now.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
we were so effective. One guy actually left, and like 20 or 30 minutes later, we're going down to the next brothel, and he's coming out of that one. I'm like, oh, well, that was effective. We just sent him somewhere else, so you try.
Yeah. Yeah. I
But
mean,
one other thing you made me think of was the raids. So
yeah.
I used to get called every now and then to translate for some of the women coming out. And last year they called me, and I was talking to this lady, and she was 65, which is very unusual. And so it turns out her story, her husband sold her to pay his gambling debt. And somehow from China, she's shipped to America and is in this brothel and beaten to hell. And this happened to be a raid day, and she was, one of the people they brought out. And I mean, she was so traumatized, just so traumatized. And I was trying to work with her to get her into a shelter, but most of the Asian shelters are in California, where they have, all the resources. And she was so afraid. She's like, no, I'm not leaving. I'm not getting on a plane. I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying here. And, I'm going to, whatever. I mean, there are resources here, but not as extensive, I guess, as in California. And so she was so petrified.
Wow.
It was, oh my gosh, it was heartbreaking.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine.
So do you happen to know, I mean, other than these few times, what generally happens when they do a raid? What happens to the women? Do you have any idea?
I don't, but that's
Okay.
such a good question.
Yeah.
Because I know that they're trained, that they don't arrest the women like used to happen years back, that they recognize their victims. But I don't know. I think that you think about Houston used to have a Chinese embassy here. And I'm like, how do we have a Chinese embassy in Houston? And yet we've got this huge Asian trafficking issue, So I don't think the embassy was a part of the solution by any stretch.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it.
So what happened to them?
Part of the
They may have
problem,
been-
maybe.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
probably. Of course, thanks to the last administration, we're no longer on good terms, and they burned all the papers at the embassy and were evicted. So,
Yeah.
Politics.
Yeah, politics. Yeah. Wow. This has been great. So it sounds like there's some huge challenges. Any other blessings or anything else you want to share? You shared about some challenges. You shared the blessing of you actually having spent 15 years in China, and with your health professional background and being able to integrate that where you work, and then on your in your work. Anything else you want to share about maybe something for the future? What are you dreaming for the future for this situation?
That's a good question, because I'll probably retire in a couple of years, and I won't have access to people just, coming into my clinic where I have opportunity to reach out. So what's next? I think I'm so busy trying to survive every day with the American C18 patients, that are so complicated. I don't know. I see myself volunteering in some capacity. I have a heart for Asians. I love, all things Asian, especially having an adopted daughter from China. So I don't know. That's a good open-ended question.
Yeah,
I'll get back to you on
that. I'm sure we'll be in touch, and I'm sure I'll find out sooner or later as we'll be staying in touch for sure. Anything else in general that you'd like to add that maybe I didn't ask, or something that you want to share?
Yeah, I think additional blessings is I've had so many patients over the years tell me how appreciative they were that I asked the question, are they okay? Has this happened? And just asking the question. I read an article where, a lot of childhood sexual abuse occurs. They grow up to be obese. And so I've had a lot of patients that are obese, and I've just asked, may I ask you the question, were you abused as a child? And that just, opens the door. And so I've had so many opportunities to just say, may I ask you? And have so many people come back to me and tell me how appreciative they were, or they'll say, no one's ever asked me that question.
Yeah.
so many people have just been overlooked in that regard. And
Right.
the blessing has just been giving them a chance to be heard and seen, I think.
Exactly. And the blessing is just to have the health professional have the courage and take the time to see the human that's in front of them and to ask the question. Ask that question is not so hard. It may seem awkward, it may seem intrusive, but you're a doctor. People expect hard questions from the doctor. And they want you to, I mean, what I know is that we have this opportunity, and if you don't ask, no one else will. And we have that responsibility, but it's also expected that the patients don't want to bring this up because of the shame. But when we have the privilege of being in a position to ask these questions like this, and then the barrier's down. I mean, not all the time, but a lot of the times for those people that need to hear. And if it doesn't come down, no harm, no foul. But for those that need to hear that question of, like, how are you as a human? And yeah, it's powerful.
Absolutely.
It's powerful.
It is. And I think I know our time is probably open for questions soon, but there's some very creative things being done in Houston also that I'd like to mention. When we do outreach, we carry lipsticks that have a barcode on them, but the number is actually the national hotline for human trafficking. And so we try to give those out specifically to the women and let them know what that number is. And so that's a very innocuous way to get information out. My daughter's hospital, what they've started doing is on the discharge papers, if someone wasn't ready in the hospital, on the discharge papers, they have a barcode and it has the phone number for the national hotline. And I think that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Because everybody knows, barcodes you don't pay any attention to. But to come up with creative ways of reaching out and getting resources into the hands of the people that need it. There are also some organizations here that have created posters with the pull tabs that are in all the hospital restrooms. Mm-hmm. And of course, in the States, I'm sure that all the states are probably similar, but Texas is requiring at least 3 hours of human trafficking training.
Yeah, well, not too many states yet.
Not too many. Okay, so
not too many. I think it's a handful. Less than 10, I think.
It's progressive, but
yes.
I think I would be remiss if I also don't mention the part that pornography plays.
Yeah, 100%.
In human trafficking. And I know that that's a talk for another time, but just like healthcare, when I see diabetics, I think about the obesity that came first. Mm-hmm. I started thinking about human trafficking, and I'm like, what's driving this? And pornography is a huge thing driving the demand. And so just backing up and seeing what's behind this as well. Why is there demand? And what can we do about that part?
Yeah, well, yeah, totally messed up. And then that reminds me, actually, when you were talking about the obese, asking your obese patients that question, because that's how the original ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, came about, was in an obesity clinic by internal medicine doctors. Yes. And that was almost 30 years ago or something. And then they started discovering the adverse childhood experiences, and they've come up with the ACE questionnaire from asking the patients in their obesity clinic about childhood trauma. And so
fascinating. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. And so that's how that came. And then, so there's child abuse, neglect. Anyway, I don't want to go down the whole list, but there's about ACEs. 10 things. Yeah, the ACEs. Yeah. So I did another talk on that another day. So, well, this has been absolutely fascinating. Actually, we can keep talking, but this has been absolutely fascinating to talk with you. I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure the our participants and the other people watching this and listening to this on their podcast will learn a lot. And hopefully, my hope is that they'll hear what's going on in Houston, and not that they'll move to Houston and join you in your work, but then they'll start having their eyes open about what's going on in their own city. What's going on? What gifts, what do you have to offer the women or the men or the boys or the trans in where you live, because it's going on for sure. And so just open your eyes and start asking, what can I do about this? And how can you're a health professional. And so if you're a health professional, you can get involved in clinics and start asking these questions. But if you're not, maybe you're a teacher, maybe you're, whatever you have, you can start tutoring, lots of stuff to do, to get involved, to, reach out, share dignity, humanity, with the people who are victims of human trafficking, or at least get involved in prevention. At least.
Absolutely.
At least.
Yes, small towns and big cities, they all have Asian brothels. Throughout Texas, the places I've traveled to, unbelievable, especially near Army bases. Really anywhere. So I know that Texas is not unique.
No, it's everywhere, people. Wake up.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, if we have time, we could talk about the recruitment, because we really haven't even touched on the recruitment in terms of the domestic trafficking. What's happening with recruitment?
Yeah, well, it's just you and I. Hey, why don't it's just you and I right now? We could do that. Are you talking about the recruitment of the Asians, or just of the domestic? Okay. I tell you what, we've been going on a few minutes. I think I should have you on again, and we'll talk about pornography. We'll talk about domestic trafficking. We'll have another good conversation, but I'll let you go, and we'll just save this for another time.
I think that would be delightful, sadly delightful.
Yeah. Well, hey, it's happening. We need more people to get excited. We're excited about this, not in a good way, but we're excited about it because it's something that needs to be done. And so hopefully this will be, I want to inspire you to, if you're watching this, if you're listening this, get in touch with me. If you have specific questions for Jennifer, then I can put you in touch with her. And let's all work together to stop this. And let's do it. How about that? Great.
Thank you, Catherine.
Hey, it was a blessing. The pleasure was all mine. And so I'll let you go. Have a great Saturday. And we'll see the rest of you back on the next time the doctor is in. Bye. All right.
Bye.